Hey everybody, welcome back to another week of film history. This week we're not tackling an entire other decade. Once we hit the 1930s, things sort of explode and there's a lot of interesting things happening there. And also, we're not even to the 1930s yet. We're talking about synchronous sound this week, and that actually started in 1926. If you want to be a stickler about synchronous sound dialogue, that's not until 1927. It would be Warner Brothers to push the popularity of synchronous sound in film with their invention, the Vitaphone.
The introduction of the Vitaphone has been received both by the public and the artistic world with a great deal of interest and favor. A description of this creation from a more or less technical point of view may therefore be of interest to you.
The Vitaphone is a sound on disc invention. So the sound exists on a record essentially that plays in sequence with the projector. So the projector plays the record at the same time as it plays the film, thereby giving us synchronous sound. It would only be around for a few years. By 1931, it was pretty much out of date for an optical print, so sound on film, so the actual sound waves. You may have seen like digital sound waves if you've ever recorded something. Those little sound waves could be printed to film right alongside the actual visuals for film, keeping our synchronous sound working very well. Now, synchronous sound has been something that filmmakers and inventors have tried to achieve since the beginning of film. If you remember way back when with the kinetoscope, if you look through the little viewfinder, but there's also little headphones that go in your ear. It kind of looks like a stethoscope in the guy's ears. They did play music that related to the visual, but there was no way at the time to get those two elements in sequence, and they weren't synchronized, right? But Warner Brothers found a way to do it with their Vitaphone. They didn't take huge chances with it, but Warner Brothers wasn't the biggest production company at the time, so they needed something to kind of set themselves apart from the other companies, and they thought the Vitaphone would be it. So they made a whole bunch of short films that utilized the Vitaphone, and a couple of feature films that used it as well. Don Juan was the first feature film to have synchronous sound using the Vitaphone. And it didn't have any kind of dialogue. It was mostly just, it resembled a silent film a whole lot, except the music was kind of standardized. It wasn't an orchestra playing along with the film. It wasn't a player piano playing along with the film. Instead, there was a record that went along with the film print for distribution. So it was a standardized soundtrack. There was a film very soon after called The Jazz Singer, which most attribute to be the first sync sound film. It's not, but it is the first sync sound film to utilize dialogue. So the idea with these feature films from Warner Brothers that used sync sound was, we're not going to take a huge chance by completely redefining how film is shot and sounds. Instead, we'll just have synchronous sound for musical elements. So in Don Juan, it's the actual music behind the film. In The Jazz Singer, it's a musical, so every musical number has synchronous sound. That said, the actor in The Jazz Singer, Al Jolson, while playing one of the songs, also included some impromptu dialogue, and audiences really liked it.
You like that, Mama? I'm glad of it. I'd rather please you than anybody I know of. Oh, darling, will you give me something? What? You'll never guess. Shut your eyes, Mama. Shut them for little Jackie. Oh, I'm going to steal something. I'll give it back to you someday, too. You see if I don't. Mama, darling, if I'm a success in this show, Well, we're going to move from here. Oh, yes, we're going to move up in the Bronx. A lot of nice green grass up there and a whole lot of people you know. There's the Ginsbergs, the Guttenbergs, and the Goldbergs. Oh, a whole lot of birds. I don't know them all. And I'm going to buy you a nice black silk dress, Mama. You see, Mrs. Friedman, the butcher's wife, she'll be jealous of you.
Oh, no,
yes, she will. You see if she isn't. And I'm going to get you a nice pink dress that'll go with your brown eyes.
Dickie, no,
What do you mean, no? Who is telling you? What do you mean, no? Yes, you'll wear pink or else. Or else you'll wear pink. And, darling, I'm going to take you to Coney Island.
Yeah?
Yes, I'm going to ride on the chute-to-chute.
Oh.
And, you know, in the dark mill.
Yeah?
Ever been in the dark mill?
Oh, no, I was...
Well, with me, it's all right. I'll kiss you and hug you. You see if I don't. Now, Mama, stop now. You're getting kittenish. Mama, listen, I'm going to sing this like I will if I go on the stage, you know, with this show. I'm going to sing it jazzy. Now get this.
And that would start the era of the talkies. Now synchronous dialogue would become a thing in films. It would take a while for synchronous sound to get across the globe, but as soon as optical prints of sound became a standard, sound in film became a standard as well. Now remember, with the sound on disc version of the Vitaphone, you would need a whole new kind of projector system, so things would need to be retrofit, and a whole lot of theaters did this between 1927 and 1931, but it would be a whole lot easier for theaters to incorporate the sound on film version that would come a little bit later on. The Vitaphone trademark logo is still seen after 1931, even with optical prints. It's just kind of Warner Brothers standard. This is a talkie production, or this is a synchronous sound production. Even when it didn't actually use the Vitaphone, it's still a Vitaphone production. So we're going to take a look at two films that existed in that early sound on film era. We're past 1931, so we're a little bit past the sound on disc era, but we're still very early in synchronous sound. There's some other things going on in the world besides film technology, though, and I think it's really important because these two movies probably couldn't be more different from each other, except for the fact that, you know, they are synchronous sound films.
1929. The financial house of cards collapses, and the overinflated stock market plunges into a Great Depression. A financial panic grips the world.
So I'm sure you've all had a history class before and you've heard of this, but in 1929, there was a stock market crash, and that was the beginning of the Great Depression in the United States. And the Great Depression in the United States didn't just stay in the United States, but it also spread across the globe, including Germany, which was arguably hit a lot harder than the United States. Looking at two films from these two countries should be fairly interesting in how they approach things. So in the United States, you might think because of the Great Depression, there would be less interest in film, or films wouldn't do as well. But in reality, the complete opposite is true. Starting at the Great Depression, we have the golden age of Hollywood. This is an arguable timeline. If you look at certain film history books, they'll attribute, you know, the birth of the feature film as the beginning of the golden age of Hollywood, but a whole lot of people would attribute, you know, the Great Depression and the sudden rise in popularity around synchronous film and around the Great Depression as the beginning of the golden age of Hollywood. And what we see in the 1930s around this time is just an explosion of different genres, of different forms of film. We see the first animated feature film. We see the rise of B movies. So you have an A movie that you go to see normally, and then a secondary movie that you kind of get free admission to go see by going to see the more popular movie. So a whole lot of things that have stuck with us and stuck with our nomenclature about film come from this particular era. And we're going to take a look at a film from the golden age of Hollywood. And, next week we'll still be in the golden age, but, this is kind of towards the beginning of the golden age of Hollywood, called Gold Diggers of 1933. And there's another thing that's really interesting about this particular time period, the 1933, and just slightly before then. And that's the advent of the Hays Code, which came out in 1934, was standardized in 1934. And the Hays Code is like the precursor to the MPAA rating system. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but films are rated from, G to rated NC-17 and everything in between. There's PG and PG-13 and R. And that kind of dictates who can see the films or who the films were, what kinds of audiences the films were intended for. And in some cases, there's slight censorship in regard to these ratings. So if you're a 13-year-old kid and you try to go see an NC-17 movie in the movie theater, chances are you will not be allowed in. Even a rated R film, I think that most movie theaters will not let a child younger than 16 into a rated R film without a parent or guardian present. And in terms of NC-17, no NC-17 movies can be advertised through regular media, so it can't be on in the newspaper, which used to be the way that movie theaters would advertise which films they were showing. But before the MPAA had its rating system, they had the Hays Code, which was a standardized thing to, protect the new and emerging audience of feature films. So remember 1929 and on, we have this huge influx of new film audience members. So lots of children are going to see films now, and the content within films may not have been acceptable for children. There's a huge conservatism going on in the US government about comic books being too violent and teaching children to commit violence. And the lifetime argument that we hear even today of, does violence in the media cause violence in real life, was kind of taking off at the time. So the Hays Code was established to sort of standardize all films so that they will be suitable for people of all ages. Now, when you look at the Hays Code in detail, you'll find some things that are probably expected considering what the intended purpose of the Hays Code was, and then other things that are kind of bizarre and other things that are certainly troublesome, just like most of the early years of film history, and even, some of the current years of film history. So adultery was to be avoided, nudity was never permitted. These things are kind of maybe what you would expect, but also things like interracial relationships are not allowed. Homosexuality was not to be depicted. So these things that we saw in this very, very short period of time in the early 1930s was kind of erased. Hollywood had an unprecedented liberalism in this time that you probably don't expect if you haven't studied film history before. If you know these older films from the maybe mid to late 1930s onward until even like the late 1950s and even into the 1960s, you probably think of things as being relatively tame in terms of their content. And the film that we'll be watching for this lesson, Gold Diggers of 1933, certainly breaks a few of these rules, and it's considerably more entertaining for it. They're not restricted by the jokes that they can tell. And I think that you'll probably find it refreshing from something a little bit later on. If you can compare this to The Wizard of Oz, that would only come a few years later, you'll notice that there are significant differences in terms of the types of content between the two films. So over in Germany, the Hays Code does not exist for filmmakers. There's no restriction on the content that they're allowed to produce at the time. But even if the Hays Code was around, you have to remember Gold Diggers is before the Hays Code. Fritz Lang's M is also before the Hays Code, so that wouldn't account for the differences between the two films. Instead, you just see some diverging trains of thought on how to depict the world as it was at the time. So what you'll see in Fritz Lang's M in terms of poverty and how society is shown and growing paranoia around singular events and how people band together is probably a little bit more close to reality than what we see in Gold Diggers. In Gold Diggers, the tone is much more lighthearted than M. M is much more pessimistic. And I think that that divergence can be traced back in time in film history. So in Germany, you had German Expressionism just prior to M and these other films coming out in the Synchronous sound era in Germany. And then over in the United States, we didn't really cover the US in the 1920s, but you have movie stars rising up and Charlie Chaplin becoming a big thing. Charlie Chaplin was still a pretty big thing even in, the Synchronous sound era. But comedies were a big deal in the United States, whereas these science fiction, horror, and crime movies were a bigger thing in Germany. So because those two very different types of films were being made in these different countries, I think that could account for at least some of the divergent thought processes behind making these different types of stories. Now, Fritz Lang's M is an incredibly interesting film. It not only utilizes sound very, very well throughout, it also utilizes cinematography in ways that we haven't seen before. It sets the tone for noir films, which would come later in the United States. It sets the tone for procedural crime media. So like you don't just see it in film, you see it in television shows. Like if you watch Law and Order or CSI, the basis of that, you can draw a direct line back to Fritz Lang's M, and you'll see it kind of play out in an interesting and efficient way in this film. There's a whole lot to appreciate about the techniques that Fritz Lang employs here. Now, last week, if you looked at Metropolis, it is the same exact filmmaker. So Fritz Lang directed Metropolis. He directs M here. And he was also kind of influential in the whole, the beginning of German Expressionism in film. So he had his hands in Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. But take that with a grain of salt, because a lot of filmmakers took credit for influencing the look and the story that was in Caligari. And Fritz Lang is no stranger from stretching the truth to tell a good story. So he was at least approached by the Nazi Party to, create Nazi propaganda films. He eventually fled to the United States, where he would continue his filmmaking career for quite a while and make some really good American films. And in some of those films, in some of his American films and even his German films, he took some shots at the Nazi Party, sometimes a little bit subdued and hidden, taking those shots, but other times very overt in in his criticisms of Nazism. That said, he has a very interesting and entertaining story about his escape from Nazi Germany, and I will link you to that video. It's just an interview of how he got out, but there are quite a few things in there that are suspect. I don't think that he's telling the exact truth, and his timeline doesn't exactly add up for how things actually played out and the real records of when things may have happened. So maybe parts of his story are true and other parts are stretched to create an entertaining story, like a whole lot of filmmakers do. But if you're at all concerned about liking a particular filmmaker because he's from Germany during a period where Nazis were rising up, and who wants to appreciate the work of a Nazi filmmaker? Fritz Lang isn't really that. He was very outspoken against the Nazi Party. Other filmmakers did certainly go down that route. So I think that it's always important to separate the art from the artist, and sometimes there are great films made by terrible people, but then again, sometimes there are terrible films by terrible people, just like what we saw about 2 weeks ago with Birth of a Nation. So this week in your blogs, you have two films to watch. One is Gold Diggers of 1933. The other is Fritz Lang's M from 1931. Both films were produced at a time where sound was new and there was a lot of economic strife in their respective countries, and we're going to look at both of those topics with the films. A little bit of compare and contrast. How did Gold Diggers deal with the economic issues in the United States? How is it a reflection of the time? How is M a reflection of its time in its country? Also, how did each film utilize sound? So we're in that early stage of sound. One's a musical, the other is a crime drama. So, the content of the films very, very different. But we're looking at these two things that are similar in at the time for both movies. Now, Fritz Lang's M is readily available on a lot of streaming platforms, including YouTube for free. But as of recently, Gold Diggers of 1933 is a little bit harder to come by. So you may need to rent this one. It's certainly out there to rent for a fairly affordable price. So once again, no textbooks in this course, but you may have to rent a few things. We are getting to the point where YouTube is no longer going to be an option for us. I think Fritz Lang's M is the final film that is just up on YouTube for free currently. And even then, it's like a copyrighted work and it could come off at any point. So after this week, YouTube is no longer an option for us, but almost everything that I choose will be on HBO Max under Turner Classic Movies. So they have just like a huge plethora of, film history type movies or movies that had a significant impact on film history. And we'll just choose from their collection there. That said, all of the movies that I choose will be available on some form of streaming. You just may have to pay to rent them and stuff. So if you want to make your life easier, maybe an HBO Max subscription makes sense. If you have your own ways of finding these things, if you want to just rent from the library and stuff, that's totally fine too. Whatever means is just fine by me, so long as you can actually watch the film and have enough time with it to write your blog entries. All right, that's it for this week. Another short one, but 2 movies for you to watch again. Next week, we'll have a choice of an either or. So only one movie next week, so you can have a bit of a sigh of relief, and we'll get into the technicalities of Technicolor. So I will see you all next week with another film history lecture.